So now we're moving on to, the presentation part of the workshop. And I really, the topic is shoreline living, and I really view this as kind of like a fundamental course about shoreline processes and coastal dynamics, and a bit about shoreline ecology as well. Before we kind of jump into that, and I pass the floor on to Tracy and Jessica, I want to give you all a brief overview about our program, what Shore Friendly is, so you have a better sense of what we do and the services that we provide to the community. So again, for those of you who missed it, I'm Christina Korecki. I'm the coordinator for Shore Friendly Kitsap. I'm with Kitsap County in DCD, the Department of Community Development. And I'm also here with my team member, with Amy Smalley, who is the outreach specialist. So to begin, how do I get this to go? There we go. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement to the First Nations peoples and their lands here. The Suquamish, Port Gamble Squalum, Jamestown Squalum, Skokomish, Puyallup, and Squaxin Island peoples have lived on and stewarded these lands on and around the Kitsap Peninsula since time immemorial, and continue to do so today. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step toward true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the Indigenous peoples of this land and beyond. So Shore Friendly Kitsap, we service all of Kitsap County, so that's unincorporated, incorporated shorelines. So that includes all the 4 cities: Bainbridge Island, Hallsbow, Bremerton, and Port Orchard. Our mission is to empower Puget Sound waterfront landowners to create beautiful, environmentally friendly shorelines for themselves and for generations to come. The program is regional, so for every shoreline that you visit in Puget Sound, there'll be an associated Shore Friendly. The programs are all sponsored by different entities. So for example, in Kitsap, it's the county that we are the sponsor. In other places, it could be a conservation district, or the Marine Resource Committee, like Northwest Straits, also is a sponsor. We're funded by the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program, which is an arm of WDFW, so the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we've the county in of itself, we've been very active in shoreline restoration for many years. So this program has been going on since about 2019, but the county has been involved in Shore Friendly since its pilot program days, which was about 2015 when it started. And even before that, we've been pretty active in shoreline restoration and had a big EPA grant in the earlier 2000s, and actually did a bulkhead removal project at Anna Smith Park, just down the street here. So we've been, pretty busy. I get this to go. Okay. So why the focus on shorelines, and why are these nearshore habitats so important? Well, they really are a critical connection between the land and the sea. It's this special kind of transition zone, between these two worlds, the aquatic and the terrestrial world. And because it's this transition area, it can be very, very productive. And I think this picture here, which is a photo from a beach near Hansville, really shows us how these two worlds kind of come together. You've got this very sandy beach that has a lot of sediments. And where do those materials come from? Well, from the uplands, from banks and the cliffs nearby. You have the overhanging vegetation that Tracy taught us about, just providing shade to the beach. A lot of insects can actually fall out and drop out of the overhanging vegetation, organic matter, debris, and creates this very productive spot where important species like the surf smelt will actually lay their eggs on the upper part of the beach. So these Small silvery fish, which are, play a big role in the overall marine food web, will, depend on those beaches for a really important part of their life cycle. And, not only surf smelt, but then there's sand lance, there's herring out, further out into the intertidal. And of course, salmon and orcas are all dependent on those fish and organisms that are at the more bottom of the food web. So shore friendly, we are trying to really support those healthy and resilient beaches. We help landowners who are interested in removing some or all of their bulkheads. So that hard arm ring, people who want to venture and take on a shoreline restoration project. We provide technical support to guide them through their projects from the beginning to the end. And our program is totally voluntary. We depend on landowners to approach us. We're not regulatory in any way. And we deliver our program through a range of incentives, and we try and make the process easier, and we try and reduce barriers that make projects difficult. So this support that we offer, first, we offered free general site visits to any landowner who would like one. We also offer visits from contracted geologists to landowners when those folks are kind of more seriously considering a project and considering removing their bulkheads, to examine the feasibility of that in more detail. And then we offer some cost incentives and financial support to shoreline landowners through mini grants for supporting designs and construction grants to support implementing those shoreline projects. And then lastly, we also help out with permitting assistance and cover some permit costs as well. And I just wanted to put in a small plug in for our free site visits. And those are, done by our shore-friendly staff, and it's a general assessment of your property, and we will go out to your site and help you learn more about the beach dynamics, like the part of the drift cell that you're in, look at erosion potential and wave energy, also go over the fish habitat and wildlife resources that you have. Drainage and slope stability are other things that we talk about, as well as looking at the native plants on your site and how to manage the vegetation. And then look at any opportunities that you may have for creating a healthier beach and taking kind of these shore-friendly actions, from maybe native planting to even considering removing a bulkhead. So for today's workshop, we really hope that we can provide you, the landowner, with some tangible, useful information that you can apply to your site, increase your understanding about coastal systems, and then give you, ways to best steward your property so that it can be resilient into the future. So that I'm going to pass it over to Jessica and Tracy. We're really lucky to have these two here. Well, Blue Coast Engineering, they're on the forefront of a lot of cutting edge research, tidal flows, estuaries. So we're lucky to have them. And right now, we'll just open the stage for them for the next hour or so, and then take questions at the end. So if you could hold them to the end, that would be great. And there'll be a lot of time to ask questions. So please, don't be shy and ask away at the end.
She has our slides on here.
So they're on the desktop. So yeah.
I see you've got a file explorer open on the other screen, on the big screen. Oh, yeah. That should be it. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, just a little technological exchange here. So, real quickly, I'm gonna introduce myself again and then pass it over to Tracy to really start the presentation. Jessica Cote, so, I am a coastal engineer. So I have a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. I'm originally from the East Coast, so I went to school in Boston. And then I got a master's in coastal and ocean from Oregon State University. So here on the West Coast. I have worked on both coasts and around the world. I've been in Puget Sound for about 18 years. While I am an engineer, a lot of people also consider me a geomorphologist. And what that means is that I really look at that intersection between the geology and the coastal processes to understand how our shorelines are shaped and formed by those processes, which are all like habitat forming processes. Excuse me. I just totally lost my train of thought. So I'm going to pass it over to Tracy.
And I'm Traci Sanderson, ecologist or biologist. Ecologist just means I look at the animals and where they're living. So ecos, their house. So I tend to look more at the environmental habitat of critters rather than the critters themselves. I'm a professional wetland scientist and certified fisheries professional, and I've got a master's degree in environmental studies, and I've been doing this for about 20 years or so. So I'm going to start by going over an overview of the presentation. So I'm going to start off talking about nearshore habitats, with which Christina sort of touched on, and I'll expand upon that a bit, talking about eelgrass and kelp, as well as forage fish and salmon. And then I'll talk about shore types, so the different types of landforms that we have on our shorelines. And then Jessica will talk about forces on the shoreline, including water levels, wind waves, wakes, tidal currents, and then talk about how those forces change the shoreline. So beach profile, so how steep or flat your beach is, and then sediment movement along the shore and across the shore. And then what we as humans have done to change the shoreline. So we've talked about hard shoreline armoring, which could be bulkheads or riprap or piers, and then alternatives to that hard armoring, something you might have heard of, which is soft shore protection or beach nourishment, managed retreat, drainage manage, and then I'll talk about drainage management and vegetation at the very end of it. And I also just wanted to point out, I know Amy mentioned, so there is a handout, and there's little links within the handout that when you get it as a digital version, you'll be able to click on that and find, further information about whatever that blue highlighted link is. And it looks like there's a few people who didn't make it to the beach walk. So there is also a little handout that kind of went along with the beach walk that just pointed out some highlights at Illahee State Park. So if it's a nice day and you want to go there afterwards, you could always go and kind of give yourself your own beach walk tour afterwards. So first off, I want to define, we've used the word nearshore a couple of times now. So I want to define what that means. And what we're talking about is typically anywhere from where the vegetation along the shoreline is, so approximately 200, 300 feet inland from where the water is, all the way out until the end of the photic zone. So that's like where vegetation can grow in the water, where there's enough light penetrating through the water that there's vegetation growing. And that whole area along there is the nearshore zone. And from a legal standpoint, that 200-foot mark that I mentioned is typically the regulatory boundary. So from ordinary high water mark, which is roughly, like, you can think of a little bit above mean high water, 200 feet laterally inland. That's what, in terms of permitting along the shoreline, is the area where you would need a special shoreline permit to do any work on your property. So some things that happen in the nearshore that are important is you might have bluffs on your property or adjacent properties. And Jessica mentioned this on the beach walk, that sediment will fall down. It might bring down trees or anything, rocks with it. It deposits that on the beach and can accumulate in that upper intertidal area on the beach. And it can move both across the shoreline and along the shoreline. And it's really providing the base material, the sediment along the beaches, not just in front of that bluff, but all along the beach. And in lower areas where there's vegetation directly adjacent to the beach, I think Christina mentioned, sometimes insects can fall into the water, and those terrestrial insects have been shown to be a really important food source to adult salmon. It also creates shade along the shoreline, so shade that provides kind of an area where fish can maybe hide out and avoid predation, but also when they're laying their eggs on the beach, it's shading those eggs that are laid on the beach and allowing them to actually develop and hatch out. In the offshore area, there's kelp and eelgrass and other submerged aquatic vegetation that fish and other species use as like a rearing habitat. And as that vegetation dies, it'll wash up on the shore as wrack, and it can be a little smelly, but that's driving other food webs, such as like those little beach hoppers that you see. They're breaking down all that detritus. And then those beach hoppers are food for fish and food for birds, and it's all kind of interconnected. So all very interconnected in that upper intertidal. And then if you have a stream, not all streams obviously are salmon spawning streams, but fish can congregate in those areas. And I'll also point out, like where we were today is a herring holding area. So herring will hold offshore from that Illahee Beach State Park area, and then they move up towards Paulsbo, and that's where they'll spawn on submerged aquatic vegetation. And salmon will use those streams to rear, as well as they'll come back to their natal stream to spawn. So that salmon is, well, rainbow trout, steelhead is coming up the river to spawn, and then it's bringing all those nutrients that it gathered as it got big in the ocean and being fertilizer. And salmon, particularly Chinook, are the key food species for orcas. So it's kind of like all interconnected, all important. And I'll also just point out, when we were at Illahee and we did that icebreaker, I think everybody, you either mentioned views or you mentioned something related to biology about why you like living on the shoreline. Nobody's like, well, I just love my riprap bulkhead. Like that's my favorite, like they might like that. It's like something is their access to be able to get down to the beach, but it's because you want to get down to the beach. You like being on the beach. You like being able to see the beach. So shore friendly is really just about how can you live better with that thing that you already love, right? So just kind of reinforcing having a healthy shoreline supports forage fish, which I've mentioned, and we'll talk about more. Support salmon because the salmon eat the forage fish, and then orcas eat the salmon. And so it's all interconnected, all these little pieces. Eelgrass and kelp are really important submerged aquatic vegetation throughout Puget Sound. You tend to, we're in an area where you will have both. In South Sound, eelgrass tends to not be as big of a thing because they have such a wide tide range in South Sound that it gets too desiccated on the beach and it doesn't grow, but definitely there's kelp and eelgrass around here. Salmon are obviously a really important species, and they use the shoreline to navigate on their way out to the big open ocean. Depending on the species, they may spend more time or less time in that near shore area. And certain species like the listed Chinook salmon really tend to use what are called like non-natal pocket estuaries or streams to rear and get big before they go out to the open ocean. And there's been a lot of work that's shown we've actually improved a lot of the freshwater areas habitats for salmon, and it's in this marine phase where they're not surviving and making it back to spawn. So the marine shoreline of Puget Sound, as well as the big open ocean, is really important for salmon's survival. Forage fish. So that's a wide category of fish that essentially just means they're forage, they're food for other animals. Sand lance and surf smelt are the two that you're gonna hear the most about as a shoreline property owner because they spawn on the upper intertidals of the beaches. So they come up at high water and they spawn right along that mean higher high water interface, which happens to be where in the 1950s is where we all decided that we would put bulkheads, and we're literally covering the habitat that those fish spawn on, or we're just disturbing it enough that they're not doing as well as they used to historically. And WDFW has a online database, and there's a link in the key points handout of so that you can go on and see exactly like, have they ever surveyed on my beach and have they found eggs there? And surf smelt and sand lance tend to spawn in like finer sediments, sand lance, it's a little self-explanatory that they like sandy stuff. And the surf smelt is just slightly coarser, but if it's like cobbly or bouldery in front of your property, most likely they're not gonna be spawning there. Oh, this is just an example of the data you'd find. So you'd see there's little dots, and then you can click on a dot and it will actually like tell you the date that they surveyed and if they found eggs and what type of eggs they found. And then they extrapolate that out based on the habits to say like, okay, we sampled right here and we found eggs. So we're gonna assume that, this 1,000-foot stretch is spawning beach. This is a cross shore looking at the beach and giving you an idea of where these fish would spawn. So herring spawn offshore and they need submerged aquatic vegetation, or they can actually spawn on man-made structures as well, but they need something three-dimensional in the water that they spawn on. All these fish are broadcast spawners, so the male and female like get in close proximity and just kind of let it all out. And then the surf smelt and sand lance, they go higher up on the beach. You can see it's pointing out like the drift logs up here. So they're kind of right below that drift log line. Sand lance slightly lower than the surf smelt, and sand lance in slightly finer material than surf smelt. And if you happen to be in an area that's really prolific, I mean, it is something that you would visually be able to see the eggs, but that is fairly uncommon to be able to see them. That's it for the nearshore habitat stuff. So I'm going to move on to coastal landforms. And the reason why we want to, this is just going to be a brief section, but the reason why it's important is because what type of shoreline you live on can really dictate or play an important role in what type of things you can do on your property, or what types of things would even be beneficial in terms of maintaining your property. Jessica will talk more about this, but for example, on a high bluff, having a retaining wall structure that's 10 feet high at the bottom of a 180-foot tall bluff really isn't going to do anything for stability on that shoreline. And there's lots of different types of landforms in Puget Sound. Rocky shorelines, I know for sure, like Port Orchard area, there's a lot of rocky shore forms. This is Waterman Point on the west side of Port Orchard. Pocket beaches. This is Nick's Lagoon, which somebody said they live right by. So sometimes this one is an example because this is owned by the county. There actually is a house that's behind it, but in some places homes might be built right on the spit, the barrier spit that's in front of that, or all the way around it. Or in some cases, these areas have been filled in and people have built houses directly on what used to be a barrier embankment. And you can imagine that those people might be having some issues with flooding of their homes. And then beaches and bluffs are our most common shore form. Sometimes they can obviously vary a lot in height around Puget Sound, and depending on where you are, homes may be built at the bottom of a bluff, or they might be at the top of the bluff. They might be set back. They might be really close to the top of the bluff. It varies a lot depending on area and when your home was built too. A low or no bank. General categories of just like something less than 5 feet in height. Imagine that you could go from your house to the beach and just walk right down. You wouldn't need a structure or stairs or anything like that on a low or no bank. A medium bank is something roughly 5 feet to 20 feet, and you would need either some really good agility, a rope swing or something, or stairs or a steep path to access the beach. And then high banks or bluff, generally anything above 20 feet. And you could have a structure to access the beach, but it's going to be fairly robust and probably more difficult to maintain than that medium bank or bluff. And just for our reference and to give you guys something to raise your hand for, can we get a show of hands if you live on a low or no bank beach? Very few. Medium? Okay, and high? Oh.
And anything other. Okay, okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Okay, great. I'm gonna talk a little bit about water levels. So Puget Sound itself is an estuary. Hopefully many of you know that, but I know many people don't realize that. So it is the mixing of fresh water and salt water, right? We're not the open ocean. And we are driven by tides. And we have 2 high and 2 low tides a day. Not everywhere in the world does this. Has 2 and low and 2 highs a day. I realized from a group of my college friends recently that not everyone is aware of that. Some places only have 1 high and 1 low a day. It depends on where you are relative to the equator. But essentially, this is just a image trying to demonstrate where these water levels fall on the beach. And the reason the water levels are important is because, again, we're talking about these coastal processes, these habitat forming processes, and these shore form forming processes, and water levels are the major part of that. You'll hear me talk about total water levels. Sometimes people talk about dynamic water levels. Tides are predictable, and they're what we consider to be a static water level because, well, yes, they change, they go up and down. They're predictable. So that's kind of the important part of it. And they're for engineers, they're a datum. So that means it's something we can measure relative to. We can say, okay, your bulkhead is this high above mean high or high water, for example. It's a relative elevation for us. So mean low or low water is generally, way out there, depending on the beach slope. We talked about this a little bit at the beach walk. Depending on the beach slope, you might have a wider low tide terrace or a narrower low tide terrace. Steeper beaches have a narrower low tide terrace. Mean tide level, kind of what it sounds like, sort of in the middle of the beach. Most of the dynamics on our beaches in Puget Sound really happen between sort of the mean tide level and the mean high or high water, because that's the portion of the beach that's most frequently underwater. And then mean higher high water, usually up near the toe of the wood. Tracy mentioned ordinary high water mark, right? Often corresponds to that elevation. Ordinary high water is a regulatory jurisdiction. It varies in elevation. We as engineers do not like it because it really is difficult because it has a variable elevation. It's not a set number. And there's specific ways that that's delineated. So it's more of a biological indication. And datum. And then the high tide line is actually the Army Corps of Engineers jurisdictional line. And so but it's also an astronomical tidal datum as well. And that's pretty high up, so kind of at the upper extent of the wood and the vegetation. So if we look at these same kind of water levels on a shoreline with structures, you can see that most of the time those structures are actually encroaching on that intertidal beach that Tracy defined, and they're falling below that highest water level. Natural beaches have the ability to actually adjust with water levels to a certain extent, depending on what's on the landward side of them. But if we give them space, then they actually have the ability to adjust on their own. When we put structures within that dynamic zone, then they really don't have the ability to adjust on their own. So in this case, the beach is much coarser. We talked about that a little bit out on the site visit. So often when we see structures like this, we get a coarsening of the beach. So that's why the low tide terrace here, for example, doesn't look sandy. A lot of times, most of the time, a low tide terrace is sandy. And then from the mean low or low water to mean tide, it generally can be a little bit coarser, and then it gets finer as you move up the beach again. So you can have sandy offshore and sort of sandy upper beach, but mean high water is sitting basically at the toe of that bulkhead, and the king tide or high tide line is sitting on the bulkhead in this example. So sea levels are rising. In Puget Sound, it's been very well documented based on very long-term data collection. But it's important to recognize that our land forms are also, some of them are sinking and some of them are rising, and it varies in Puget Sound. So Washington Sea Grant, or University of Washington Climate Impacts Group with Washington Sea Grant, has put together a great tool, and you can go in and you can click on a particular area of the shoreline. So this is highlighting that blue area. So the graph on the right is representative of relative sea level rise related to the blue area. And what that means is sea levels are rising, the land might be sinking, or the land might be rising. So it's taking into account that change in the land elevation as well as sea levels in this prediction. And then it's providing numbers that go out to 2050 and 2100, and they're always a range. There's lots of uncertainty in this data. It's based on big assumptions about what's going to happen on the globe, right? In our world. So that's why there's a range of numbers. The numbers are more certain when you get closer in time to where we are right now. So at 2050, right, the numbers are pretty similar. So about 0.7 feet is the prediction for this particular area of Kitsap County by 2050, and it could be as much as 2 feet by 2100. So these rising sea levels, so all of these components of water level, so our current sea level, then we have potentially our future sea level, we have high tides, we have king tides, we've had like December 27th, 2022 was this extreme king tide event in Puget Sound. We saw a lot of flooding, we saw a lot of damage to bulkheads, but then on top of all those things, we also have storm surge. So storm surge is when wind blows across the water and literally piles it up on the shoreline. So it's adding to that total water level component. And we're seeing more and more that we're getting what we call overtopping or overwash of water over top of structures that were built a long time ago. So their lifespan is now come to its end, and they're not doing what they were intended to do at what time. This is a very good example of where we're also, I talked about encroaching and beaches not being able to change, right? So these homes, this is actually being built on a barrier spit. So Tracy pointed out in Nick's Lagoon, we showed sometimes homes are on barrier spits with estuaries behind them. Barrier spits and that zone is a very dynamic zone. There's a lot of change in the beach in that area. And so if we place homes there, they can expect to have a lot of maintenance requirements as a result of them. It's difficult to hold back the ocean. And this is just getting worse over time. So this is out in the San Juans, this is American Camp, and this was built on dry land, but it's not any longer. And this is the December 27th, 2022 event when we had that king tide. So we're getting more of this flooding. And we mentioned briefly, coastal structures are not meant to protect flooding. So especially the ones that we have placed here on the shoreline. I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those as we go. I think I have like 1 or 2 slides, but it's harder to protect from that flooding than it is to protect from the erosion, especially when we're trying to soften shorelines, right? So we want to soften shoreline. So if we don't allow space for the shoreline to change on its own, it's harder to soften them and also protect from floods. So wind waves are controlled by the wind blowing across the water. So the length of time that wind blows at a particular speed, at a higher speed, the length of water that it can blow across, so the uninterrupted length of water before it hits a landmass, which is called fetch. The water depth is also a controlling factor. A lot of people don't talk about that, but we have something that's called depth limited. So literally the waves start to feel the bottom and they can't grow any bigger than that. And then the orientation in which that wind is, the wind waves are hitting the shoreline actually has a large influence on the transport of sediment around our shorelines. So in Puget Sound, our winds are primarily coming either out of the southwest, coming up the Columbia River Basin and up Puget Sound, and then there's a convergence zone. So if any of you have been over like Snohomish County, northern Seattle area during the snowstorm, you might know this because you'll be driving on I-5 and all of a sudden it's like the snow gets really, really intense and then you drive out of it because it's a convergence zone in that particular location. So the other winds that come through the Straits of Juan de Fuca actually turn and come from the north-south. We're seeing some changes in wind patterns over recent years as well, related to climate change. We think it's been very difficult to tease out exactly the reasons, but we know we're getting some additional westerly winds that we didn't really have. We're seeing shorelines with more change that didn't change a lot historically. So there are some nuances and some differences, but generally our biggest wind events come out of the south. So if you have a shoreline that's exposed to the south with a long fetch across the water, you're going to get bigger wind waves than if you have a shoreline that's exposed to the north or protected from the south. I mentioned vessel wakes also do move sediment. It depends on where you are. This is Rich Passage, so Point White is on the north side, and Point Glover is on the south side with Port Orchard down around the bend. So there's been we did a lot of research and study for this particular program, so we're very familiar with it. And definitely it's a contributor to movement of sediment on the shoreline, but only really it's the worst in the narrow waterways. So if you live near a narrow waterway and you have a lot of vessels transiting, you might be experiencing some sediment movement from vessel wakes. I mentioned tidal currents. Tidal currents aren't the primary driver of sediment transport in Puget Sound. Again, a few exceptions. When you have tight bends, again, narrow waterways, then constrictions, right? So if water is flowing from a larger area to a narrow area, it's going to speed up through there. And then when it gets through that narrow area, it's going to decrease in speed. So in general, they're not a big mover of sediment except for right at the points of land. So you'll see right at the point of land, oftentimes you don't have as much sediment on the beach. So it's really important to recognize that erosion is a natural process. I know it feels sometimes like nature is working against you as a homeowner. I live at the top of a steep slope. I'm not on the shoreline, but I am on top of a steep slope. So I totally understand that challenge. My backyard, when we first bought our house, was slowly moving this way, which is not really what you want, especially if you have a lawn and you're trying to mow it. It's like, but we need the sediment, from these high banks and high bluffs to deposit on the shoreline, because that is what is going to regenerate that habitat and the beach and provide all of those things, that we love about the shoreline itself. So it is a natural process. It's a really important process. And beaches change seasonally, and they also change over really long periods of time. So some of the work that we did in Rich Passage, we actually found a 4-year cycle. So beaches would be higher, and then 2 years later, they would be low. And then at the end of a 4-year period, they'd be back to that elevation that they were at the beginning of that 4-year period. And this is representative of seasonal storms. So we get these bigger events that occur every 5 years or every 10 years or every 100 years, right? So every year we may not have them, but we'll get a bigger event every few years. So that's kind of why you see that cycle. So this is just showing an example of on the top, you can see that there is sand on the upper beach near the intersection with the bulkhead. And in the summertime, there is gravel. So the beach is actually higher in the summer than it is in the winter time. That's pretty typical. And those gravels are actually moving in and covering up the sand. So the sand is underneath. If you were to move the gravels away, you would see that there is sand underneath. And a lot of our beaches in Puget Sound are very unique because they are this mixed sand and gravel. And that's because we were formed by glaciers. So glaciers came across the landscape. They picked up all kinds of different sediment. And then as they receded and melted, they deposited those sediments. So our geology varies so much from one property to a next, oftentimes. And the mixed sand and gravel is a much more complicated movement than sand beaches. So this is just demonstrating a little video. So wind pushes waves towards the shoreline. As they hit the shoreline at an oblique angle, they tend to transport sediment along the shore. And there, where you see a change in the curvature of the shoreline, you'll get things like a sand spit forming, for example, or larger deposits of sediment. And then we have the feeder bluffs right there that deposit the sediment on the beach. They feed the beach, and then when the wind waves come back in, they'll continue to move that sediment along shore. So it's just a continuous process, which is why we need, to armoring, where we're trying to remove armoring, not just in front of one property, but multiple properties, and really thinking about things in that bigger context, that interconnectedness. We talked about this a little bit. We looked at the boat ramp out at the beach walk and saw that, the sand was a little bit higher on one side than the other. At Illahee State Park, it's a pretty quiet area. There's not significant wind wave events, so it wasn't a dramatic effect. This is a pretty dramatic effect. So this pier, unlike the one that we saw at Illahee State Park, has a lot of understory structure, right? So things that are really blocking wind waves, blocking sediment from getting through. If we have piers, it's better that they're as open as possible underneath. You can also get light penetrating panels on top too, which helps with what Tracy was talking about with this fish swimming around them. But this, you can clearly see that the shoreline is much further seaward on the downdrift side than I'm terrible with downdrift and updrift. You'd think I would be better given my profession, but I'm just not. So I'm going to say on the south side, closer to us, and then on the northern side. So sediment is moving from the lower portion of your screen towards the pier, being blocked, and then the shoreline is receding on the other side. So smaller residential structures, again, similar to what we talked about at the boat ramp, they can also, block drift. And it can have impacts on your own property. It can have an impact on adjacent neighbors' properties. Just things to think about as you're doing things on your beach that you may think are harmless. They might actually be having unintended consequences. So this movement of sediment by wind waves is something we call littoral drift. Littoral is a fancy term for nearshore, or we just call it drift sometimes in Puget Sound. And these are all mapped. So the drift cells in Puget Sound are mapped. They're a pretty large scale. So this is not an absolute. This is on average over longer periods of time. In this particular graphic, it's saying that we have southeast winds that are coming, hitting the shoreline. In general, sediment is moving towards the north. And you might also, so the red is what we call no appreciable drift, which basically means it's just not really moving. It's probably a quieter area. I would actually say where we were at the park is kind of one of those no appreciable drift quieter areas, because it's a little bit more protected. But again, when you look at the whole drift cell, the full length of it, like that's just a small section. So they don't map it parcel by parcel. It's on a longer beach scale. And then this is just another example. This is a convergence zone. So that's Point County Park, where you have sediment moving along the northern shoreline towards the point. And then you have sediment moving from the south to the north, and they're converging and depositing there. If you've ever been there, you'll know it's very, very sandy. And it's really dynamic. It changes a lot. Because it's getting wind waves from both directions. So any storm event is going to create some kind of change out there. So you can document some of these changes on your shoreline. If you have concerns or just interested in how fast is my shoreline potentially changing, these are some really, really easy ways to do it. Photographs, simple, right? We all have a phone, it's all got a camera on it. So we recommend taking photos at a minimum twice a year. So in May, you're coming out of the full winter season and would have what we would call its winter profile. And then on October, you're coming out of the summer. You've gone through the whole summer season. So that would be exhibiting its summer profile. And you'll start to notice some changes, especially if you're thinking about doing anything relative to your shoreline. For me, as an engineer or anybody who's going to do a shore-friendly site visit, it's incredibly useful if you have photographs. And we recommend trying to put it in a scale if you can, if there's nothing to measure relative to, if you have a staircase even, taking some measurements, putting in a yardstick, something like that, taking the photos from the same point each time, the same perspective. So again, it's useful to have something in those photos if you can. And you can measure, you know, to the toe on the top of the bluff, depending on how high your bluff is as well. And then, yeah, making records of date and time that you took the photos. If you have a big storm event and you go down and you see change, another time to great time to take photos then maybe take photos a few weeks later. Did it actually recover from that storm event? Yeah, on its own, perhaps, or maybe it didn't. And yeah, documenting any changes you see with structures. Again, staircases, if you don't have bulkheads, are a good thing that you can document. You can also take photos perpendicular or along shore. And so this can just give you a bigger picture of the sediment, the types of sediment across your shoreline. It gives you a longer stretch, you know, of your structure, if you have a structure. Go to the next one. So if you have a high bank or bluff and you're concerned about the top of that receding, another thing you can do is you could put a stake in a safe distance away from the crest of that bluff. And then you just measure from that stake out to the crest of the bluff, again, to a safe distance, but see if that changes over time. And maybe you'll notice changes, maybe you won't, but also taking photos when you're doing this documents the type of vegetation. Maybe you have a tree and you notice, well, that was straight, you know, for the last couple of years, but all of a sudden it's starting to lean, for example, right? So you might notice changes in your vegetation as well if you're taking photos on a regular basis. Okay, so how many of you think that climate change and sea level rise are affecting your shoreline? Have you seen changes that you think things are accelerating or different than they were in past years, in the last 5 years? Raise your hand. Okay. Okay. We're gonna talk a little bit about armoring. So hard shoreline armoring, I mentioned, they're also called bulkheads. They come in many forms and varieties. There's a lot of self-made engineers in Puget Sound, and we like to do our own unique and special thing. So they could be timber, they could be rock, they could be concrete. They might be vertical, they might be sloping. So typically armoring, it does two major things. It's like from a physical processes standpoint, it prevents sediment from being able to be deposited on the beach. So you're disconnecting that sediment source in terms of the upland to the near shore. And it can also increase beach scour. So you can get wind waves reflecting off of those structures and actually changing both the slope and sediment composition on your beach itself. So if you build within the intertidal zone, you can see an increase in scour oftentimes. So this is the same location. So on the upper right and the lower left, you can see in the upper right, there's lots of gravel at that particular location. And then down below, the toe of that structure is now exposed. If the toe of a structure is exposed, that is well beyond the end of its life, or it is getting close to the end of its life, because when these are built, they excavate it out and they poured the toe as the foundation, and then they put the material back over the top of it. So the toe is always buried when it was initially constructed. Tracy mentioned armoring of that I would talk about armoring of feeder bluffs essentially. So a lot of times people on steep slopes have a geotechnical engineer come out to look at their steep slope to give them an opinion on slope stability. Geotechnical engineers come at things generally from the land side, no pun intended there, land side down. And I come at things as a coastal engineer from the beach up. If they can't find a cause for a change on shoreline, a lot of times they'll say, well, it's wind wave erosion, or it's wind cut toe erosion. And oftentimes that's just, we don't know, really, is what should be said there. I have yet to see, I've seen one property in all the properties that I have looked at in Puget Sound that actually had wave cut toe erosion. What wave cut toe erosion means is that essentially wind waves are eating away the toe, and the slope is over steepening. So it becomes so steep that it has to fail in order for it to go back to basically vertical for a slope that it can hold. So I've seen it once. And that's mostly because we just don't have that big of wind waves here. And we tend to be getting these gentle sloughing of the face as opposed to this wave cut toe erosion. So armoring of feeder bluffs, It limits salmon supply. I know I said that 12 million times, but it's so important. That's why we say it all the time. But ultimately, they don't do anything. You can go to the next slide. They don't do anything to prevent slides. My biggest concern is that I think that they give homeowners a false sense of security. Because the processes that are generating that slope instability are coming from the upland. It's either, so we've removed vegetation, which Tracy will talk more about the effects of removing a lot of that vegetation from the upland. We don't have control over drainage, so we're discharging more water into a concentrated area into the soils that the soils it has nowhere to go, or it's simply a product of the geology underneath where you live. We often see that in Jefferson County. They have a lot of this clay lens. I mentioned that when we are out. So if you have a clay layer, water doesn't penetrate through clay. Sand is a great transmitter of water, right? We use sand filters to clean water. So sand is a great transmitter of water, but clay, it hits that clay face and it has to make its way out somewhere. So it'll make its way out the base of the bluff. And that's where we tend to see these slip places and slides. So we mentioned armoring doesn't prevent flooding. We'd have to armor the entire shoreline, right? You think about levees. Levees are meant to prevent flooding. So they have a starting and ending point though, right? And so you're only preventing flooding from where there's that starting and ending point. And as Tracy mentioned, when water gets behind these structures, because they don't have a lot of drainage in them, it's very hard for the water to get out. So it's the flooding issue is really a challenge as we have these increasing water levels. So there's been some analysis done in the San Juans, and then we did a study for Island County on the costs and the benefits of these various shoreline practices, shore-friendly practices. So removing armor, moving homes back, putting in soft shore. And generally what it's found is on low bank properties, and this is not the value of the home, it's the value of the parcel of land. So on low bank properties that don't have shoreline armoring, they have higher value. On high bank properties where the home has been set back, the value increases, and homes that have a further setback from that bluff crest have higher value, parcel, sort of acre for acre. Mid-bank, the data is very, very mixed because these mid-bank properties, people want access, they want to be able to get down to the shoreline, and there's often a combination of structures, and the data is it gets really muddy really quickly. They're also one of the hardest properties in terms of us assessing, like, can you remove armor or not remove armor or put in structures or what you're doing, because they're just in that intermediary zone. Shoreline permitting. So we're not going to talk a lot about this, but just being aware that it requires lots of permits to basically do anything on your shoreline. So, Tracy talked about that 200-foot delineation. We generally recommend starting with your local, whether it's your city or the county that you live in. So in Kitsap County, you have City of Bremerton, Bainbridge Island, Poulsbo, Port Orchard. So they're the local permitting agency. So they're your best resource to start with, or Shore Friendly is a great resource to start with in terms of, if you have a question, do I need a permit for whatever it is that this is what I would like to do? If you're building a staircase, if you're building a bulkhead, even if you're placing the sediment or large wood on your shoreline, you still probably need a permit. So really almost anything in the shoreline area you need a permit for. Yeah, okay. So hard armor removal, if it's possible, if the home is set back enough. I talked a little bit about septic out on the site visit as well. If you don't have your septic system on the short side, or there's enough buffer, then we like to look at the possibility of removing hard armor. And there are grant opportunities out there depending on the scale of the project. But essentially what we see after removal is you get recolonization of vegetation, so beach vegetation. You'll get wood accumulation that you might not have had before, and plantings in addition to the armor removal, and also things like drainage management. Comprehensive solutions are really the best. So softening with large wood. So a lot of times we'll place large wood. I think I mentioned that there's not as much large wood floating around Puget Sound. because we've removed a lot of trees, but also the Army Corps of Engineers removes it because it's a navigation hazard, right? So there's just not as much floating around to accumulate. We don't anchor large wood. So that was something that was done kind of 8 to 10 years ago. It came from practices out of working in rivers where you anchor large wood because you're trying to create scour holes that are cool pools for fish. We don't want scour holes on our beaches. At least I don't, and I think most people don't. So anchoring wood is just really, we've learned that it's just really not the best thing to do. You will get scour around that. The chains will become loose and it just becomes a nuisance over time and you end up with a lot of debris on your shoreline. In addition, you actually have to dig down to do some anchoring, depends on what kind of anchoring, but there was some work that was done with like large ecology blocks, the giant concrete blocks, digging a hole and sinking it down and chaining it. You're disturbing the beach when you do that. And our natural beaches are way more compacted than anything that we place. So that's also just something to keep in mind. If you're thinking about soft shore, you know, they'll talk to you about you're going to expect some change, like it's not going to be static. And that's one of the things that's really just important to understand about the shoreline is it just really needs to be able to change. So we need to try to allow some space for it to change. So this is an example of a private property in the San Juans that did a hard armor removal project, and they actually had fill. So they'd raised the elevation of the land behind this. And so it was really disconnected from the beach itself. The landowner loves it. She can walk to the beach. This was creosote. So we also got the creosote treated wood out of the marine environment. And I think it's prettier. So it was considered a great success. There's a lot of wood. My understanding is they did not place that wood. That was naturally recruited after the bulkhead was removed. And then this is a project that was done in Kitsap County. Again, armor removal project. Was there wood placed on this project?
Some minimal wood.
Some minimal wood.
But most of the wood you see there was.
And did you plant the dune grass or did that self-recruit? In the rocks up there? Yeah. Okay. And it looks like, so there's a lot more shell hash here, you know, so it's got a wider, what we call back beach area. So those bulkheads are really sitting in what we call that back beach area. And that's one of the most important parts of the beach in terms of habitat. And there's all that wrack accumulating in front of the back beach here. So it looks like it's accumulated additional wood. And again, I think it's more beautiful. It's certainly easier for property owners to just walk down to the shoreline, you know, in this case. We often see folks trying to use large wood as a form of shore protection. So the wood floats up and then they use ropes to basically attach it together, raft it together. It's not being anchored down, but it's being rafted together and then calling it soft shore. It's not soft shore protection. It's rafted wood. It can actually, again, cause this sort of unintended consequences of scouring around it. Depending on, you know, the degree of the structure, but just keep in mind, it's important that you try to get a specialist if you're going to do a soft shore project to not do it yourself. And because like the sand that homeowners have access to, for example, it's not the right sediment for your beach. It's like play sand most of the time, unless you're getting it, you know, from a quarry from the right source. So we look at a lot of things like what is the right sediment size, you know, to fill the holes after we've removed the bulkhead, or do you need extra material to, again, allow some adjustment from where the shoreline's been held in place? Do you need vegetation to hold it? Do you need to add wood proactively? So there's a lot of factors that go into it. Manage retreat is a hard conversation and something that we need to spend more time talking about. The most important thing about managed retreat is to think about it before it's too late. Because in this image, you have to be able to get to the front, to all sides of the home. So just think about it that way. Somebody needs to be able to walk around all sides of the home in order to be able to get it up on basically this roller kind of system. And they literally roll it back. It can actually be fairly cost effective, depending on what other measures you're thinking about. but it also depends a lot on the foundation of your home, the utilities you have, where, you know, what utilities you have to move as part of it. So costs can vary a lot, but there are some good resources that the shore friendly programs have access to. There's been some presentations by Northwest Straits Foundation, which covers the 7 northern counties, but their information is applicable across all of Puget Sound on things like managed retreat. Okay.
Drainage. All right, so I'm gonna take us home talking about drainage and vegetation. So we've mentioned that drainage and water impact the stability of your shoreline. So there's a lot of different sources of water to your shoreline. So you can have pavement runoff, so impervious surface, you know, the water flows across that and then can either drain right off the top of a bluff or onto the beach, or maybe it is collected in some sort of drainage infrastructure that you have on your property. Same with a roof. Your septic has a drain system that's, you know, going down into the geology below. Naturally occurring rain, don't have a lot of control on that, but you do have control on the irrigation in your property. So that's a lot of why we push native vegetation, because once you have native vegetation that's established on your property, you really don't need to water it because it's used to our dry summers and wet winters. Remove trees is not a direct source of water to the soil, but trees are a big source of being able to remove that water and release it back to the atmosphere. And saturated soil increases your risk for landslides. It's making that soil heavier, so it might slough off, or it's showing here an impervious layer, which is what Jessica called, you know, a lens, or she used a couple different words. It's essentially a layer that as the water is going through, it hits it and it can't percolate through very well. And then all that soil that's on top of that layer is able to slide. And that's that sort of big slide that can happen with an impervious layer like that is sort of what happened in Oso. It was all just a big mass of sediment that was on one slip face that was able to just come off in one big shot. And for the most part, most of our bluffs in Puget Sound, that doesn't happen a whole lot. We get small bits of erosion that happen slowly over time. And so some things you can look for on your property to see if the drainage system on your property is working well. You might have like clean out areas where you can actually see if it's clogged with sediment or debris. You might see pools of water like on your property, like where it's soggy and stuff. That just means that that water is having a hard time filtering through. If you're irrigating your yard frequently and deeply, you're just adding additional water to the bluff. And fast flowing surface water can cause erosion on the front of the bluff face. And something you can't really control is obviously, Jessica mentioned when we were doing the beach walk that all water is flowing from higher up in the mountains or whatever down to Puget Sound. So you may have property owners up drainage of you that may be impacting your property, and that is a harder thing to deal with, but is affecting your property. You may have drainage pipes underneath the ground that are cracked, and you might be able to spot that by the pools of standing water. There's also, during the dry season, you could also like disconnect if you have, say, pipes coming from your roof that are flowing, you know, connecting down underground, and it's all collecting. You could patch into that system and put a hose and then see where is it discharging on the beach, because that's typically what we've done on shorelines. Is when the home is built, it's creating, there's a drainage infrastructure that's put in as the home is built, and then it's funneling it all towards the beach typically. And you might see some seepage visible on the exposed bluff face, and depending on where that is on the bluff, that might indicate that you have a leak in your drainage system, or it could just be a naturally occurring seepage. So I mentioned typically in Puget Sound, I was just seeing where it highlights it first.
Oh,
is it the good?
There you go.
Okay, so that's an example of bad drainage management. So they're collecting their water upland and they're discharging it partway down the bluff. So what you would really like to do is more so what they're doing here in terms of bringing it all the way down to the toe of the bluff, and then it's something called a T diffuser. So it's just a T-shaped pipe with holes drilled in it, and as much as possible not using like the really thin like corrugated black pipe or this white pipe here that is more brittle and can fall apart. But in some cases you may be able to do something along the lines of like a rain garden or something like that, but you really would want an expert in drainage management to design and install those things, because depending on your property, you may not have enough infiltration capacity to do something like a rain garden. Here's another example of where it's being discharged up, and you can just see where like the rivulets and stuff are just eroding from that pipe discharging into discrete locations. And then marine riparian vegetation. So that's just vegetation that's growing along the marine shoreline. Depending on where you live, what direction you face, you get, you're facing east or west. Is it really shaded? Do you have invasives such as the upper right-hand corner? That's all essentially ivy and blackberry. Is it exposed or not? Like in that upper left-hand corner, the lower left-hand corner is, fairly natural in terms of that back beach area where the driftwood is, but then there's a large lawn, right? So it can look very different depending on your property. This diagram is just giving an overview of what the marine riparian vegetation does. So the leaves and the trees and the shrubs disperses the rainfall, so you don't have concentrated surface runoff. Roots uptake the water and release it back to the atmosphere. And roots are proportional to the size of the plant. So trees have a larger root system than shrubs have a larger root system than soil cover plants. But all of them work together to trap soil and prevent surface soil erosion. Shrub and trees stabilize the root system, stabilize the top soil layers, and kind of tie everything together. And vegetation provides shade and habitat. So I mentioned, the shading of the forage fish eggs. It's also providing habitat for birds. I kept looking when we were at the beach this morning, like I could hear an eagle in the trees somewhere, but anybody who lives on the shoreline has seen an eagle, perched in one of your Douglas fir trees or something like that, looking for his next meal. One of the best things you can do on your property in terms of vegetation is if you have any sort of vegetation, to keep it there, even if it is invasive. What we generally suggest is that if you want to tackle getting rid of that, ivy or blackberry, you do it in smaller chunks that you can manage. So you like do one area, you think you get that, relatively under control, and then you work your way through the area where you have invasives, because any amount of exposed soil is going to expose you to more risk for erosion. And invasive species come in a lot of different flavors, and invasive species is kind of the same as a noxious weed, is generally a non-native plant. It's all kind of synonymous, those three words, but we have Scotch broom in the upper right there that Jessica's pointing to, blackberry, English ivy, and then reed canary grass are for common ones. There's lots of other ones that we have, and depending on how it's classified by the state or the local Kitsap County Noxious Weed Board, some of them it's actually required that you do management on your property. All of these are so prolifically invasive that there's no requirement to do any sort of management of them. But suggested that if you can, it is a good idea to do something about them. As I mentioned, don't try to remove everything all at once, and dispose of any invasives that you take out in commercial compost, or sometimes when you're in a more rural area, you can do burning, something where you're not just trying to compost it in your backyard and then putting it back out again, because typically any of the cuttings can resprout and you're just going to spread it around essentially. And as gently as you can remove stuff too is generally a good idea, because the invasive species really like disturbed soil. That's why you see it growing on the side of highways and stuff like that. You can use layers of mulch or something called solarization, which is essentially when you lay down like black plastic or clear plastic for 4 to 5 weeks and let it kill whatever underneath that, and then you can remove that and do planting. And it takes a lot of persistence to deal with invasive species because they're very persistent themselves. So native plants, I pitch them for one reason, because you don't have to water them once they're established. You can purchase from local native plant sales, which are kind of going on right around this time. And I know there was a list of different native plant nurseries in the area over on the table. And pay attention to species. So that's something that I've come across a lot when doing site visits with property owners, is people might have gone out and they're like, oh, I bought, there's all these willow trees that I want to plant. And they're like some sort of willow that's either not really suitable for the marine shoreline, or it's like not even like a native species to this area, because like there's thousands of species of willows, right? So really there's only like 2 that you might find on the shoreline here, which are Pacific and Hooker's willow are the 2 species you'd find. In general, you want to plant during the wet season, hopefully earlier in the season. So over that winter, the plant has a chance to establish. And then, potentially the next summer, you may not need to water. You might need a couple years of watering depending on what it is you planted and what your property is like. There's a lot of different apps that you might find on your phone, or Google has something called Gemini AI, artificial intelligence, where you can take a picture of a plant and ask it, like, what is this plant? So, like, if you see something you like and you want to know, is it native? Is it something that, I would want to plant more of? You can do some research on it that way. Or you can potentially take cuttings to bring it to the local nursery and ask people there what it is. Or you can have a site visit from Shore Friendly and they can help you identify the plants on your property. If you have trees on your property, always suggested to use a professional to prune trees. A common thing that happens when there's views involved is that people will top trees, but it's really unhealthy, doesn't do good for the tree. Underneath that bark layer on the tree, there's a cambium layer, which is essentially like its circulatory system. And so when you top the tree, you're just exposing that tree to any sort of fungus or other critters that can get in there and do damage to the tree. So really, and professional tree pruners have lots of good ways where they can do windowing and other things where you can still maintain a view, but you also maintain the health of the tree. A great thing to do on properties that are treed, or even if they're not, is planting younger trees that can grow up in succession, because depending on the tree species, they may live for 100 years for like a cottonwood, or 500 to 1,000 years for some of the bigger evergreen trees. But eventually those trees are going to die, and you want like the next generation to be able to come up underneath it. Some examples of trees that you would find on the shoreline would be like a shore pine, or big leaf maple, or Douglas fir. There's lots of different shrubs, and sometimes you can really use them for more it's the right word, property management. Say, like, if you have an area where you don't want your kids to go, or maybe your dog to go, depending on how adventurous your dog is, you could use like rose or something thorny to plant in that area to kind of prevent, things from going over in that area. Can you go back?
Yep, sorry.
Yeah, and then there's snowberry, Oregon grape, ocean spray, and then I mentioned Hooker's willow. And also point out with shrubs in particular, there's quite a few different shrubs. Hooker's willow is one of them, where you can get something called stakes, or you can even, if you have a willow on your property, you can actually take a cutting and essentially plant those cuttings. And it's a nice, like, cheaper, cost-effective way to do plantings. There's also bare root plants, which means it's essentially just a little baby plant that's not in a pot or anything. It may not have as good of a chance of survival, but you can get it for cheaper, so you can get more of them. So it's just a couple different ways that you can, try planting native plants. And then ground covers. So there's strawberry that's native, sword fern, and then dune grass is one that's really only one that you would plant in like that upper backshore area. It's not going to grow like on the top of a bluff, but it's a great one and really, really great in terms of making that backshore more stable. And you can usually get like the plugs and stuff. It's super easy to plant and you can get a lot of it for a fairly cost-effective amount of money. And that's it.